presentation entitled A Well-Run City and Intergovernmental Affairs. My name is Leslie Wee, and I'm a professor at George Brown College. I'll be your moderator today, and I'd like to begin today's session with the land acknowledgement. As this meeting is both in person and virtual, and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement may not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. For those of us here in Toronto, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Before we hear from our guest speakers today, allow me to tell you more about the event. Civic Lab TO curriculum is presented by Strategic Partnerships and the City Manager's Office within the City of Toronto in collaboration with the 8 higher education institutions represented here today. Civic Lab TO is a unique learning opportunity which is made possible through the collaboration and partnership work with Toronto's post-secondary institutions, including a senior leadership table comprised of the city manager and the presidents of 8 colleges and universities. This esteemed group of civic leaders is forging a path of partnership and innovation between our organizations. The work includes the development of a new model for the city and academia to collaborate on multi-partner, multidisciplinary research to inform policy and programs. We are very excited to be hosting this year's curriculum right here in Council Chamber. This, as you can see, is a very unique learning space to be in, and we're thrilled that you can join us here today, whether in person or online. A tremendous amount of planning has gone into delivering the Civic Lab TO curriculum. The City of Toronto is providing us with a lineup of senior staff and policy experts for each of these sessions. Thank you to all our partners who have made this possible. And also a special shout out to the City of Toronto's virtual events team, facilities, and AV team, who are working in the background to ensure that the technology and facilities are working to present each session in a hybrid format. Lastly, a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded and participants are asked not to share any personal information within the meeting. There will be a recording made that will be available on civiclabto.ca/curriculum, and this will be disseminated to you via your instructors in the near future. If you're here in person with us at Council Chamber, welcome, and please note that we ask you to avoid joining the virtual WebEx webinar. The washrooms are located in the hallways by the elevators to my right, and there will be time at the end of the city staff presentations today for some questions and answers. If you're joining the session virtually and would like to submit a question, please do so in the Q&A feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you're joining us here in person and are sitting in the council members' chairs at the front, you may speak into the built-in microphones. To use these mics, please press the yellow button until it lights up to activate it. And once you're done, please press the yellow button again to turn the mic off. We also have a wireless microphone that will be floating around. Just raise your hands and it will be brought to your seat. Again, we remind you to avoid disclosing any personal information when you ask your questions. Lastly, everyone joining us virtually will be muted during the event. And just a reminder for all of us here in council chambers to mute whatever devices we may be on. Today, we're going to hear from Stephen Conforti, Executive Director, Financial Planning, Karen Jones, Director, Intergovernmental and Agency Relations, and Mike Pachalok, Deputy City Clerk, Member Services and Program Support, who will be joining us virtually. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Stephen to the podium. Thank you.
Okay. It's fantastic to see everyone here in the council chambers. I don't think I've seen this many people in here in over 2.5 years. So thank you all for joining us. Last 2.5 years, I've been used to giving presentations virtually, so I'm trying to get reacclimated with doing this in front of everyone again and having my speaking notes. So hopefully everything goes well. But first off, I'm Steve Conforti. I'm the Executive Director of the city's Financial Planning Division. Before I start, I'd also like to say how happy I am to be a part of this event for a second year now. And thank all of you for participating in today's discussion, specifically for your interest in municipal government. I've had the privilege and fortune to work in municipal government and finance roles over the last 16 years, in what's been an incredibly meaningful and professionally rewarding work. To share a little bit about myself, because I was told I had to. After studying business commerce in university, I began my career working in a small to mid-sized multinational corporation that manufactured flexible circuit boards, of all things, mostly for communication devices and aerospace products. I worked there for about 5 years, and given the size of the corporation, the way my role evolved over time, the interactions I had with senior management, really provided me with an ability to grow and develop. From there, I joined the City of Toronto in 2006 within the Financial Planning Division, where I am today, first as a financial analyst. I was responsible for some city programs, city planning, municipal licensing and standards, the Waterfront Secretariat around really evaluating their budget requirements, giving financial advice, long-term sustainability. And really, it didn't take me that long to realize that the strengths and skill sets that I had really complemented the role. And that, I had a great opportunity to support my client division's financial needs and ultimately help shape the services and the supports that they provided the public. First few years here at the city, I really was like a sponge. I just wanted to learn as much as I possibly could, wanted to learn about the different financial tools we had, our financial policies, and the ability really to be able to support those divisions and benefit the services we provided. Took opportunities to join different cross-divisional initiatives, working groups, and things like that. And I got to say, I didn't do it with the mind of career advancement. It was really because the passion you develop for the public service and something you see when you're here. And you really see the benefits that we provide the public. And you're able to see it in the news, or you see it when you're walking down the street, really the important work we do and how it helps shape the city, and especially in a finance role, the ability that you have. And I think that's something you're probably going to hear from a lot of the people here at the event, is really just how rewarding it is to work in the public service and how you can really, it's a bit of a calling, and a lot of us here, I think, share that same passion. To get a bit more into my career, so I've been in the city here at Financial Planning, was able to advance some roles. I took my first risk really about 5 years ago, where I left Financial Planning and joined the TTC as the head of finance there. One of the best decisions I ever made. And I was able to really get away from just focusing on budgeting and being able to look at different elements of finance. I was able to take on roles that related with treasury services, insurances and risk, statistical analysis. And it was in a a city agency where it had a really strong focus on service and service delivery. So it was able to give me that view of budgeting from more of a service perspective, rather than a corporate role that I play now. And a few years ago, I came back to the city, back in the Financial Planning Division, now as the Executive Director, where I am today. And really, all of the experience that I've had to date has been valuable in being able to support the work that I do today. So we can probably go to the next slide. So what's more important than really just my background is the work that happens here in the city in the Financial Planning Division. We're primarily comprised of financial planning analysts that are responsible for supporting each of the city's divisions, agencies, boards, and commissions. Key responsibilities you see here on the slide: providing timely and objective corporate financial advice, leading the development of the city's annual operating and capital budgets, which I'll get into a little bit more detail as we go through it, providing an independent review of the city's costs, benefits, and services. We monitor and report publicly on the city's spending and performance. We also provide representation for the city as we engage with external partners on numerous initiatives. and budgets, often working very closely with Karen, who you'll hear from later today. For today, I'm going to focus on financial planning's roles in the development of the city's operating and capital budgets. And just to put it in perspective, the city's 2022 combined operating and capital budgets totaled $20 billion. And when you look at how we budget for capital, we actually budget for 10 years. So when you look at the size of that 10-year budget, which is around $40 billion, you see that the city's combined operating and capital budget is the largest municipality in Canada and is actually larger than most provinces. So we can go to the next slide, please. So just to level set, it's probably best that I differentiate between an operating and a capital budget. So each year, the city prepares a single year operating budget and a 10-year capital budgeting plan. The operating budget is mostly referred to as the budget that covers the day-to-day expenses of providing services such as recreational programs, curbside waste and recycling collection, daycare, public health, which has been incredibly important through the pandemic, emergency services such as fire, paramedics, and police, as well as park maintenance. As long as these services are provided, costs will recur annually and will need to be factored into the city's operating budget. The capital budget's a multi-year plan that provides for the total cost of a tangible capital asset's renewal or creation. So that's the total cost of constructing, improving, or extending the useful life of a building, equipment, roads, transit, libraries, and so on. So in developing these budgets, staff must ensure that the budget is balanced. So this means that the budgeted expenditures have to equal the budgeted revenues on an annual basis. So this is a key requirement in municipal budgeting. And unlike the federal and provincial governments, municipalities cannot budget for a deficit, meaning our annual expenditures cannot exceed our annual revenues. Next slide. So as noted, the operating budget supports the day-to-day expenses to deliver city services, many of which are provided 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. The city is delivering more than 150 distinct services, often reflecting the services relied on daily by residents, businesses, and visitors to the city. So operating budgets are developed for each of the city's divisions and agencies. As noted, when delivering the city's overall budget, we must ensure that the final recommended budget is balanced. So this is a key challenge as added costs generally exceed our annual revenue increases that we can expect. So to put that in perspective, generally, as we start a budget process, we usually have opening pressures of about 400 to 600 million that have to be offset. Mind you, every 1% residential property tax increase only generates $34 million. So as part of our efforts to balance the budget each year, there's 4 fundamental considerations that must be reviewed. So the first is costs associated with maintaining existing services. So this is reflecting inflationary cost increases that you might see in our expenses. It might reflect increased costs associated with growth or demand. It can also include the full year costs of things that might have been implemented part year in the prior year. The next thing we look at is opportunities for savings and balancing actions. Opportunities to find offsets, a review of line-by-line reviews, a review of what our expected expenditures are versus what we actually think we might spend in the other year. Opportunities to generate efficiencies, meaning to be able to provide a service at a cost savings, but not having an impact on the service delivery. The third section we look at is what we call new and enhanced. So it reflects areas of added investments to either provide for new service offerings or enhance the level of existing services. So in 2022, 135 million of new and enhanced investments were made to build a prosperous Toronto focused on equity and reconciliation, modernization, and a safe and livable city. And then the last element that we look at is the future year outlook. We need to understand what is the implications of any decisions we're making today on future budgets and being able to plan for that accordingly. Next slide. So the capital budget provides for the total cost of asset renewal or creation. So the city is responsible for building new assets and infrastructure, as well as keeping our existing assets and infrastructure in a state of good repair. The costs associated with this work is included in our capital budget. The city's assets have a replacement value of greater than $150 billion. The 10-year capital plan outlines capital investments requirements, which fluctuate by year, but average about $4.5 billion annually. So the capital budgets are also developed for each city division and agency. When developing the capital budgets, projects are considered against 5 categories. We'll look at health and safety requirements, legislative requirements, stated good repair, which is essentially the investments we need to make to be able to ensure our assets stay in proper working condition, growth-related projects, as well as service improvements. So stated good repair funding traditionally represents the majority of our capital spending within the city's 10-year capital plan. Addressing the stated good repair backlog is a key capital priority with over $23 billion in funding directed to these needs over the next 10 years, including significant investments to address transit infrastructure and address the Toronto community housing building repairs. Even with the level of stated good repair funding, staff continue to project that our backlog is actually going to grow, in large part because of the age of our assets. Further capital investments are also influenced by the city's strategic plan. These priorities help shape budget decisions, ranging from our investments in affordable housing and transit, which represents the largest areas of our investments, as well as the introduction of a climate lens in our budget process, helping in decisions and how we invest. Examples include decisions needed on investments for electric buses as opposed to diesel, or as we're building a new facility, ensuring we're building it to our green standards. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, I'll run you through some of the steps we took as part of the 2022 budget. We're now kind of in the midst of the 2023, but we're not quite finalized yet, but I'll walk everyone through 2022 and some of the steps we took there. So 2022 budget was developed consistent with our priorities. In each budget year, we established guiding principles for both operating and capital budget. So on the operating side, our first principle was to manage COVID impacts and ensure a path for recovery is established. Since March of 2020, we've responded to COVID-related demands across many city services. Our second principle was to preserve existing services consistent with public health guidelines and legislative requirements. Third, we also strive for a budget that promotes tax affordability, especially given the economic impacts of COVID-19. And finally, we focused on building a prosperous Toronto for all with an emphasis on equity and reconciliation, climate action, and health and well-being. On the capital side, the first principle being that the capital plan continues to build upon investments committed to as part of past budgets, including investments in climate, transit, and housing. Second, our partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario is vital to fund city programs and services that are supported by our capital assets and infrastructure. We'll continue to leverage $4.9 billion in provincial funding and federal funding for investments in key areas such as mobility and housing. Third, we continue to focus on developing a capital plan that's both achievable and affordable. And really why this is a key principle is, as we're identifying really finite opportunities to invest in capital needs, we want to make sure where we're directing those funds are towards projects that can actually be delivered. We don't want to see that we're directing funds to a project only to find that there's delays or issues, and we could have otherwise invested those in other needs that we had. And lastly, the city continues its capital modernization efforts with a focus over the next years towards developing a capital asset management plan. And then lastly is around partnerships, and it's critical that existing and new partnerships with the province and federal government continue into 2022, especially given the impacts of COVID-19. Next slide. So this slide speaks to the budget process and timelines. Budget process begins with guidelines and targets being developed by the Financial Planning Division for our city divisions and agencies. Divisions and agencies then prepare individual budgets for submissions into the Financial Planning Division. The CFO and Financial Planning then hold administrative reviews with the divisions and agencies to evaluate those submissions. Ultimately, the city's senior leadership team provides a balanced budget based on reviews and analysis that was undertaken. We then launched the budget publicly through the city's budget committee. And then from there, the budget is reviewed and considered by the city's executive committee and then ultimately city council. I will note that we're still understanding the implications of Bill 3, Strong Mayor Building Homes Act, for future budget processes, and we're expecting some changes moving forward to the process that we've seen. Next slide. So this slide's interesting. So over the last few years, we've had to somewhat alter our process for budget approaches given the impacts of COVID-19 on municipal finances. So the slide captures 8 years of historical opening budget pressures driven by inflation and growth. So when we say that every year, like I said, when we're building our operating budget, we know there's increased costs to continue to maintain our level of service. You can see on this slide the impacts of COVID-19 have had on those costs over the last 3 years. The reason being that the pandemic results in significant financial impacts to municipalities in the form of added costs and actually even more so in revenue losses. Toronto and other municipalities with large transit systems and shelter services experience a disproportionately greater financial impact as a result of COVID-19. So going into 22, we were already facing inflationary and growth-related pressures of $583 million. With COVID, that opening budget pressure actually increased to $2 billion. So we continue to work internally to manage and mitigate as much of the city's pressures as we can. And really, since the onset of the pandemic, the city has implemented mitigation measures, offsets, and spending constraints that have totaled $1.6 billion to address these pressures, and really, more importantly, support the continuity of service delivery. As we're committed to continuing to find offsets where possible while preserving essential services for residents and businesses. Unfortunately, we know that the financial challenges as a result of the pandemic are going to continue for a few more years. Next slide. So the expected 2022 COVID-19 impact totals $1.4 billion, predominantly arising from reduced TTC revenues due to ridership impacts and added costs within our shelter system to ensure adherence to public health guidelines. There were also reductions in corporate revenues, such as our parking revenues, our municipal accommodation tax applied to hotel usage, and other corporate revenues, as well as added costs to manage the COVID response, both in public health and our long-term care homes. Next slide. So in 2022, our approach to the budget was first and foremost to separate out COVID impacts from all other budget requirements. Balance the budget, look for opportunities, finding efficiencies, offsets to balance that budget when you exclude the COVID impacts. Maintain service levels and invest in key priorities, and maintain property taxes in line with inflation. On the capital side, we were looking at the application of the city building levy to support key investments in Toronto housing. So the city building levy is a separate levy that is dedicated, essentially a property tax increase that's dedicated to support our capital needs. Maintain our debt service ratio under 15% for all years within the 10-year capital plan. So our debt service ratio is ensuring that we are not spending more on debt servicing costs than 15% of the revenue that we bring in. And it ensures we're able to maintain 85% of our revenues to deal with our operating pressures. And focused investments in mobility, housing, climate, and modernization. On the COVID-19 side, again, we separated out the $1.4 billion in COVID-19 operating impacts. And then we were working to secure continued COVID-19 support funding from the federal and provincial governments and develop a strategy that could impact the availability of capital funding in the event that that funding was not forthcoming from the feds in the province. Next slide. So 2022 was a challenging budget shaped by the continued impacts of COVID-19. We've seen added costs to deliver services in a safe manner, while revenue sources traditionally leveraged to offset inflation and growth costs were expected to decline. One of the key principles in our budget was to manage COVID-19 impacts while also preserving existing services consistent with public health guidelines. The budget also included a further $135 million in new investments focused on equity and building a prosperous Toronto. All of this was achieved while keeping property taxes affordable. The capital budget reflected an increased city building levy, which enabled the city to further advance our commitment towards housing and transit infrastructure demands. And lastly, the budget is still expecting continued federal and provincial supports to offset COVID-19 impacts of $1.4 billion, with an estimated $554 million in COVID supports secured to date, meaning the remaining 2022 COVID-19 funding shortfall of $815 million is critical And it's critical that further intergovernmental COVID funding be secured before the end of the year. Otherwise, there will be an impact of the funds we have available to deliver on our capital needs. So that's it for me. I thank you all again for participating in this event and your interest in municipal government.
Thank you, Steve. Next up, we have Karen Jones, Director of Intergovernmental and Agency Relations. Karen?
Good morning, and thanks for the applause. We're not used to getting that all the time. So nice to be here. My name is Karen Jones. As Leslie said, Director of Intergovernmental and Agency Relations in the City Manager's Office. And very pleased to be here to speak with you this morning. I want to follow Stephen's example by just giving you a bit of a blurb on where I've been career-wise, and then get into my presentation on intergovernmental relations for City of Toronto. So very briefly, I grew up career-wise in the Ontario government, although I feel I've been here a very long time. I've been here over 10 years. I came over on secondment from the Ontario government. That means I was on loan for a specified period of time, and I decided to stay. Basically, I made the move to be closer to the street, to where the reality of services and programs were, in order to really understand the needs of the residents of City of Toronto. I thought it would be more satisfying, although I did enjoy operating at the strategic level at the Ontario government as well, doing a lot of work in organizational reviews, governance work, and actually services as well. I was one of the founding members of Service Ontario. So to see it grow up to what it is today is very gratifying. I really enjoyed my work at the Ontario government. I thought it was really helpful working for a government that was one employer, but many, many ministries doing different things. And so what that offers is experience, a variety of experiences, an opportunity for growth while staying with the same employer, having that stability and, developing seniority and the ability to hop from one ministry to the other. And that I did. I started out at the Ministry of Natural Resources. I worked with the Ministry of Transportation. I worked with Economic Development. I also worked at the Central Agency, which basically gives you a bird's eye view of the entire Ontario government from a governance standpoint and legislative standpoint. So that was very valuable as well. And then now to City of Toronto. Since coming to City of Toronto, I've stayed in the City Manager's Office. It's that hybrid between being closer to the street and being at the strategic level, so it suited me well. The City Manager is, in effect, a central agency, and so I was comfortable in that environment. I did start out with a focus in agencies. And you may or may not know that City of Toronto has over 130 agencies and corporations, including, like Stephen said, the TTC, Board of Health, Toronto Public Health, Create TO that does negotiations regarding the disposition of buildings and lands. It is, Toronto Community Housing Corporation. So over 130 of those, very interesting, all different portfolios. And now I have both them and intergovernmental relations. So it's very demanding, but very challenging, but very rewarding as well. So to get into intergovernmental relations and where we are today, let me see if I can. So I'll just say that the intergovernmental activity at City of Toronto is varied. It's sometimes unpredictable. It covers a wide range of bureaucratic work as well as political work. The function exists in order to influence other governments' actions to advance and meet city priorities and objectives, mitigate negative impacts and optimize opportunities, including obtaining our fair share of investments. You notice that in Stephen's presentation, it had throughout his talk about revenue sources and pressures, references to the federal and provincial governments and other agency partners. But it's really key that we support the effort to attract as much investment from the feds and the province as possible. We strive to mitigate negative impacts and optimize opportunities, including obtaining a fair share of investments. We maintain and advance Toronto's government-to-government relationships and partnerships to protect Toronto's interests and, more importantly, the best interest of the residents of the City of Toronto. And by extension, residents of Canada, because we are recognized as the economic engine of Canada as well, and that's not to be forgotten. And we also strive to achieve better, more informed decision-making by all orders of government. Next slide, please. Thank you. But we don't do this alone. It's a web of intergovernmental partners. Various city partners are involved in the city's intergovernmental relations. You have the mayor, who's the political lead on intergovernmental affairs and represents the city in that capacity. You have council members, and between the mayor and council members, there is some strategic guidance, directions, directives, and support that provide us with the priorities we move forward with in the intergovernmental realm. There's the city manager, who is the head of the Toronto Public Service on the administrative side. And the senior leadership of the city serves as public service leads, supported by the city manager's office, which provides corporate leadership and strategic alignment. And not to forget, there are divisions who are directly responsible for the delivery of programs and services. We are a support group that partially enable those services to be delivered. So ideally, the chart should be turned upside down to show that we're here to support the work, the real work of the divisions in an operational program and services sense. Next slide, please. So about the intergovernmental and agency relations team, as I mentioned before, we have a dual portfolio, somewhat related because the Toronto Public Service is one continuum between the bureaucracy and all its agencies and corporations, and there's a very close governance relationship between the two. The intergovernmental and agency relations team in the city manager's office works to facilitate strategically aligned city decision-making, advocacy, and engagement with other orders of government, as well as supporting horizontal alignment and coordination of intergovernmental activities across the organization. So more and more, City of Toronto tries to not operate in silos, program silos, but to operate horizontally across divisions to make sure that our policy positions and our programs and our services are integrated as opposed to separated in silos. So we play a role in that horizontal effort as well. Our strategic objectives are to provide proactive identification of potential impacts to, but mainly opportunities for the city, to lead a common city approach and response to intergovernmental issues and engagement, provide oversight and best practices on the city's engagement with other governments, and provide a corporate understanding and response to current intergovernmental issues and trends relating to opportunities and threats to city services, programs, priorities, and funding streams. Next slide, please. On one side of the house, our intergovernmental activities, advocate for city interests and priorities in a strategic and aligned manner, support delivery of city programs and services, and we do that by advancing the city's legislative and policy agenda with the other governments. We also do that with our regional and national municipal partners. Alignment of city priorities with the mandates of other governments, as I've said, provides secretariat and policy support for regional and national municipal partnerships to advance city priorities. Support intergovernmental or interagency meetings of the mayor, the councilors, city manager, and senior city officials. Coordination of city intakes to intergovernmental funding streams to optimize funding for the city. And chair and participate on many intergovernmental committees and tables. Next slide, please. So our federal engagement and national municipal relations. And the key there is to advance city objectives requiring intergovernmental partnerships and collaboration. On the federal national relations side, the key networks are the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and we have acronyms. We have lots of acronyms, like in the case of FCM. We have the Big City Mayor's Caucus. We have the Big City Executive Partnership that we call BICEP, and that's a meeting of the CAOs nationally. Just the major cities. And then we have the Big City Intergovernmental Table. That's the staff to staff touch points that we have in place to make sure that we communicate well on a weekly basis and that we're all on the same page to the extent possible and customized according to our individual municipal interests. And then direct engagement, advocacy, and consultation with the federal government, including at the federal and bureaucratic levels. Next slide, please. Our provincial relations at many levels, once again, direct engagement, advocacy, consultation with the Ontario government formalized through, and note well that our major instrument for collaboration with the Ontario government, government to government, is the Toronto, Ontario Cooperation and Consultation Agreement that we refer to as TOCA. And that provides that the city as well as the Ontario government will maintain fairly open communication in a timely manner, and that we maintain confidentiality when such is required. It also requires that there is adequate consultation when there is a major strategic or legislative impact on either party. The key networks provincially, and these are just examples, there are many of those tables, as I mentioned before. First of all, of course, the Ontario Government Ministries, the Premier's Office and the Executive Council, of course, Cabinet, Ontario's big city mayors, mayors and regional chairs of Ontario, we refer to that as MARCO, and the regional and single tier CAOs that we call RESCAO, and the Municipal Government Relations Network, MGRN, because as always, we need connection at every level, the political, the bureaucratic, and staff to staff. Next slide, please. So regional municipal relations, this is quite a network between the City of Toronto and the other municipalities within the province of Ontario. And as you may know, there are 444 municipalities in Ontario. And Toronto is a major city, largest of Canada. And as Stephen mentioned, we are sometimes equivalent in GDP to some provinces and territories, and for sure, more than territories. And so what we try to do in terms of our relationships is to maintain as much symmetry as possible when dealing with other municipal governments. So we normally have more transactions with major municipalities than we do with the very small municipalities in Ontario. Having said that, we do connect with AMO, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. We do touch points with them to make sure that to the extent feasible, we maintain the same voice on key political and legislative agendas. More importantly, there's the OBCM, there's the mayors and chairs, and once again, at the bureaucratic level, we have the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area Regional Prosperity Alliance. We have the MGRN, the meeting of staff at a senior level, the regional and single tier CAOs, and the Municipal Government Relations Network. So many of those that we touch base with on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or quarterly. Next slide, please. International, not a well-known aspect of the work that we do. Given that we're a major order of government, we do have many tentacles internationally, organizations, global organizations that we connect with, that we share best practices with, that we share, exchanges with. We have formal alliances with through MOUs and so on. So just to give you a bit of introduction on our international relations file as well. And the objective is partnerships and collaboration with again, all orders of government, provincial, national, and international. So lots of government-to-government relationships and one-to-many and many-to-one relationships as well. So we're responsible for managing the city's membership in international and intergovernmental city networks. We provide strategic advice in the context of federal, provincial, and regional, intergovernmental, and international engagement as well. We serve as the corporate policy lead regarding oversight of the international policy framework, as well as supporting interdivisional coordination of cross-corporate international activities. And not, once again, not to forget that International also lives at the divisions and that they're involved with partners globally as well. Next slide, please. And I will skip that slide. I think I've said enough about international engagement. If we can go to the next slide. And that's the end of my formal presentation, and we'll be happy to entertain discussion and questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Third and last, we have Mike Pachorlik, Deputy City Clerk, Member Services and Program Support at the City Clerk's office. Mike will be joining us online, so over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Let me share my presentation. Okay. So thanks again for having me here. It's really exciting to be here. And I'm going to, again, follow suit with Stephen and Karen about my background. So I'm going to talk to you today about the role of member services and program support in the City Clerk's office as part of elections and council transition. I'm really new to my job. I've only been with the City Clerk's office for the last 4 months, but this is my third career with the City of Toronto. I joined in 2005. I came in as an articling student into the legal services division, and I became a lawyer as a result of that, and stayed with them for almost 7 years. I was doing legal work in municipal law, which I didn't know anything about until I got to the city. And I focused in on two groups at the time, the Solid Waste Management Division, in which I gave advice on contracts and environmental matters, and wrote the original plastic bag 5-cent bylaw charge that was subsequently removed. So happy to be part of that process. And then I also did procurement advice, and so government procurement is very interesting, which led me to take a big risk, and I jumped over to becoming the Chief Procurement Officer for the City of Toronto. And I did that for 10 years, helping the organization buy all sorts of things, from ambulances to construction to consulting, and help modernize that as well, introducing some new policies, trying to incorporate things like social procurement and supplier diversity into the supply chain, and then played a big role, of course, in the last couple of years with ensuring that our frontline staff had the PPE needed to respond to COVID. Throughout that time, I really was glued to council and the process behind running the council sessions and working with councillors. So that's why in May of this year, I jumped over to the City Clerk's office. And so this is my first opportunity to actually give a presentation on the work that we do that I do in the City Clerk's office. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what member services and program support does, and then I'm going to talk about how councillors and in an election year works, and then I'm going to talk to you about council transition. So the role of member services and program support. Last week you had John Elvidge, the city clerk, and Kelly McCarthy, one of the other deputy city clerks, talk to you about the role of the city clerk's office. To recap, we're an independent office that exists to support the public and elected officials in exercising their democratic rights and duties. The three core services we provide are we elect government, we make government work, and we open government. And my area really fits into helping make government work. So, I'm not going to read all of this. We have 6 core functions. The one that we'll talk about the most today is about council services and support. That that's where we provide the administrative support to counselor offices and mayor's office, as well as our accountability officers. But we also have other aspects. We have a IT group that provides support to those clients as well. We do budgeting, so we work closely with Steve's team, and we actually oversee mail delivery between the city buildings and have an offset print shop. So, you have to remember, what is the role of counselors? Counselors are decision makers. They are here in council chambers, directing staff on implementing policies, approving budgets. They're serving their constituents. They're trying to solve those problems. They're trying to connect issues that their constituents are having with the divisions in the city. There's ceremonial roles that they play, where they taking part in intergovernmental issues, and of course they're an office manager. They run an office, and they're all doing this governed by various codes, various rules in a number of pieces of legislation and the city's code of conduct. So they all have to play in with respect to those rules. And the role of member services and program support is to enable them to do all of that, because in order to do it, they need a budget, they need staff, they need resources, and that's the role that we play. And we do it through one of our main policies called the Constituency Services and Office Budget Policy. It's also called the CSOB. I will have to say that it's an interesting name. It's effectively a counselor expense policy. The council actually directed us to name it this. So it's one of those things where we can't change the name unless council wants us to. It has a number of principles in the policy for how they're supposed to spend their money in relation to doing their job and serving their constituents. So a couple of things that I would flag. They're accountable to the public because they're using public funds. So they have to make sure that they're using them prudently and in a way that is reasonable and reflects what the public would expect of them. So things like personal expenses should not be charged to their office expense. There's also transparency. The public needs to know how those funds are being used. And so we actually post every counselor's expenses up on our website, and they're updated quarterly. And, the kind of expenses that you might see there is newsletters, community events, travel, but you're not going to see things where, like a community event where the purpose is a farewell party for the counselor, or training that doesn't have anything to do with city business. And if a counselor is found to have breached the policy, so if they've done a party where it's a farewell party, that can be a breach of the code of conduct that they're under. And so we actually work very closely with the city's integrity commissioner on things to ensure that we're providing the right guidance to counselors on what expenses are allowable. Now, during the election year, it gets them to be a little bit more interesting. You have to remember that during election year, there's still a counselor until the end of the term, and the end of term is November 14th. But many of the counselors are also running for re-election. So they have to strike a balance, and the Integrity Commissioner has pointed out to them and through a guidance document that the Integrity Commissioner posted is that, members must arrange their private affairs in a manner that can promote public confidence and bear close public scrutiny. And during the election year, there's even more public scrutiny. And so there's an obligation to make sure there's clear separation between their election-related activities and their official duties. And the city actually has a requirement under the Municipal Elections Act to have a policy that speaks to how city resources would be used during the election period. And that policy, which we have in place through the city manager's office and approved by council, it tries to balance the needs of freedom of expression for candidates and to ensure no one has an unfair advantage, but still recognizing that counselors are counselors until the end of term, and you can't preclude them from doing or performing their duties as an elected official. So this isn't an easy thing, though, and divisions across the city have to figure out how best to apply the policy in relation to the service they provide and in relation to when a counselor comes and asks them for something, for information, for a service. And some of these things that the policy covers includes things like access to city facilities. So you cannot have a campaign event, a candidate cannot have a campaign event on city facilities or in civic squares. You may have seen in the news a week or so ago, one of the mayoral candidates was trying to do a campaign event on Nathan Phillips Square and was asked to move. And that's because policy says we cannot be allowing this on property during election periods. Other things could come up. Councilors could ask for information from divisions. The question for a division is that information something that should be shared with all of the candidates, not just the councilor, or is this to help that councilor do their official duty? And if a division decides that the information should be something shared, then we actually will post it up on the website. So that's another thing that the divisions are working on and trying to manage when they're dealing with councilors. And often what also comes up is city events. Councilors and the mayor can all attend city events and they can act in their ceremonial capacity, but they're not allowed to campaign. So these things come up surprisingly a lot of times as we move through the election period. And the election period is a little bit nebulous. I should have said this at the beginning, my apologies. The nomination day starts May 2nd, and the nomination closes on August 18th. So the election period can start as early as May for some people who've signed up and go until October 24th. And then there's also an additional factor that shows up on beginning August 1st. August 1st, communications from the city will no longer name councilors in any of our official press releases or the mayor, unless, in the case of the mayor, unless it has to do with intergovernmental relations, because then he's doing it in the role of the CEO of the city. And this last part then connects me back to the CSOB that I mentioned before, because the CSOB starts to incorporate additional restrictions on councilors' spending of their office budget. And so things like after August 1st, councilors are no longer to send out flyers or newsletters to their ward from August until election day. They're not allowed to attend conferences except FCM. So Karen mentioned FCM. They could attend the FCM if they're on the FCM board. After nomination day, so that was August 19th, no council member or council members who's chosen not to run, they're no longer able to increase the salary of their staff or attend business travel. So they can't do those things until the end of term or until the term is over. And then after election day, if someone isn't returning or if someone has lost, those similar restrictions kick in that started on August 19th for those not running, and also, but then expand. And so you can't have community events if you've lost or if you're not returning for the new term. And these are questions that come up. So before August 1st, there was a slew of questions about, I'd like to get my newsletter out. If I pay for it now and it goes out to my constituents in August, is that okay? And we'd have to tell the councilor, no, you need to have that newsletter get to your constituents before August 1st for it to comply with the policy. Now, so overall, things have been the counselors are running and they're dealing with that, with their budget policies. In the back end, my team is actually preparing for the actual transition. So all of that is a lot of administrative work. It's not, it's exciting, but I will admit it's not terribly glamorous work, but it's super important. We have to be able to transition the existing council into the new term so that everyone is enabled and ready to do their duties and perform their obligations on day one. And this year, in this election, Toronto will have at least 6 new councillors. 7 councillors have indicated they weren't running. I say at least 6 because one councillor, Councillor Buxton Potts, she was appointed to Ward 13. She's chosen to run in Ward 10. So it's a bit of a, she may not, if she wins, she's winning in a different ward and not the ward she's currently representing. And this work, this is council transition work, actually starts earlier in the year and will continue into early 2023. And it's not just for my team in City Clerks, it's actually across the organization that is involved in preparing for the new council term. So some of the things that we cover in this administrative fund is offboarding activities. So those councillors, for example, who have chosen not to run, we have to help them prepare for leaving, and that includes providing them information on their member severance that they will get. The city has a bylaw called Municipal Code Chapter 223, and it talks to the fact that councillors can get severance for not returning, and that is basically 1 month's salary for every year of service up to a maximum of 12 years. So we have some councillors who have been in office for longer than 12 years, so they will get the maximum severance. We have to, in every councillor's office, there are staff, and their contracts all end at the end of term. So there's about 200 plus staff. We have to remind them that their contract is actually ending and go through that process and help them with the potential transition. We have a lot of data and records we need to organize. And one of the things I found interesting when I moved into this role is a reminder that councillors' records, things like constituency records where they're dealing specifically with constituents, or political records about their election planning and stuff, those are all their records. They're not city records. So that means that the councillors themselves are responsible for them. And it also means that they cannot be requested through the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, because those are not city records. So when an outgoing councillor is leaving, we actually prepare everything we might have on our servers and provide it to them. And once we've done that, we delete them off our servers because they're not city records. And then, of course, there's all sorts of fun cleaning out City Hall offices and constituency offices. And then, so we're offboarding and we're also preparing for the onboarding. Whole bunch of orientational material is being prepared. This is really where all the, it really crosses all divisions who are all trying to prepare the right information for the new council to make sure that they're up to speed on the issues that each division is facing. Again, we're gonna be working through hiring a whole number of staff, up to 200 staff for the councillor offices in short order between October 24th and November 14th. We have to make sure they're enabled. So once day one, they need to make sure they have technology. They need to be on the network. They need to be able to connect with their constituents. And in case there's a mayoral transition, we actually set aside space so that if we have a new mayor-elect, that person can actually be in City Hall between, they're declared the winner and the new term, getting ready to go, but they're still separate from the mayor from the current term. And then, of course, we'll host a bunch of orientation sessions for that. Overall, we're targeting to be ready for November 14th as the end date, and then be ready for the start of the new term on November 15th, so that each of the councillors can hit the ground running and be able to serve their constituents right away without any issue and have a successful 2022 to 2026 term. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So we have time now for questions and answers. I'm just curious to know, might there any questions forthcoming from the floor at this point? Right there. Go ahead, please.
Hey, so I think this is more of a question for Stephen, but I think all of you could probably answer this. So I was curious when you were talking about all the potential revenue losses because of COVID and the increased costs. I was curious about your thoughts on the level and the type and delivery of provincial and federal support in response to COVID-19. And then also what you like to see in the future, you know, the next time inevitably Toronto faces a crisis, what you'd like to see from that response.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the impacts of COVID-19, I know I touched on in the presentation, but definitely significant revenue losses. I think really at the onset of the pandemic, and we were seeing what some of the impacts, especially with work from home orders and things of that came into effect in March of 2020. Looking at our transit ridership, we knew, you know, revenues would be generated roughly, off the top of my head, I think it was about 1.2 billion a year, meaning any 10% dip in ridership would have about 120 million loss in revenue. So we had to quickly work on identifying what are those impacts going to be, along with some added costs. And I think the biggest area of added cost that we would see is ensuring we're maintaining social distancing in our shelter spaces to help curb the spread of the pandemic, ensuring we have, you know, the adequate resources and spacing in our long-term care homes. So it was quite significant, really, from the onset of the pandemic. We have been working very closely with the federal government and the provincial government. And while the city has taken multiple actions in terms of being able to curb spending, find mitigation strategies, while at the same time ensuring we're able to, excuse me, we're able to ensure that those critical services in the wake of the pandemic, but also supporting recovery of the pandemic, were in place. You know, the feds in the province announced the SRA funding programs, the Safe Restart agreements, and there's been quite a bit of funds that have flown. We are now in 2022, essentially the third year now where we continue to have these pressures. There are still ongoing negotiations with the feds in the province. We haven't secured funding against all of our pressures for this year. And it requires us to have what we call, you know, plan B or contingency. We need to ensure that our budget does maintain balance. So, you know, we've been fortunate to be able to look at other opportunities or other options if we had to, but it's going to come at the consequence of our capital program. And you know, I think I talked about our capital needs, our growing state of good repair backlog, our investments in transit and housing, not an area where we necessarily want to scale back from, but it might be a requirement. So, you know, I'm hopeful, and we continue to have discussions and hoping that we can continue to see shared investments in transit impacts to ensure we're continuing to provide that vital service to our residents in the wake of the lost revenue, ensuring we're making those investments in our shelters, in our public health system. You know, the city is a leader in our vaccination program across the world, and these come at an expense to make sure we can continue to do that. In terms of, you know, moving forward, I will say, I think, and you know, Karen can probably speak this to better than I can, we've developed really good relationships and working relationships with the feds in the province as a result of this pandemic. I would hope we would continue to leverage those going forward. I hope we don't get into this again. It's been a long 2.5 years, and there's been quite a bit to manage as a result of this, and we're hoping we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Although I do think we all realize that, you know, we talk about pre-pandemic experience. We know heading forward, it's going to be a post-pandemic reality where things just are not going to entirely return back to where they were. So, you know, we're going to have to manage that first, let alone preparing. I think we were able to take some steps now, ensuring that we've got some adequacy and backstops built in the event that we have another instance like this in the future.
Thank you for the question and the response. And before I fish for more questions, I see a hand there. I'll get to you. If I can continue to put your feet to the fire, Steve. Theoretically, a city can generate surpluses, I'm guessing, because it has own streams of revenue. Historically, has the city ever generated a surplus? And is there any incentive for cities to do so? What might happen to that surplus?
Yeah, so essentially the city must prepare a balanced budget. So balanced budget, ensuring our revenues and our expenditures are equal. So we're not planning for a surplus and we are not allowed to plan for a deficit. What has happened though is then you monitor your actual expenses over the course of the year. And you may have underspending for whatever various reasons, both on the capital and the operating budget side. So there's different strategies and techniques we have. So on the capital side, what we allow for is what we call carry forward. So if a project doesn't complete the amount of spending that they were anticipating in the year, we allow the programs to identify the underspend and ensure that those funds are carried to the following year to be able to complete the project. On the operating side, it's a little different. We actually have a council-approved surplus management policy that dictates 75% of any surplus generated in a year is actually going to be redirected to support our capital program because of our growing capital needs. And then the remaining 20% we leverage to be able to support what we call underfunded city reserves or liabilities. So that's generally what we will do with the fund. So we have a policy, but we do generally budget and plan to ensure we're balanced. Not that we're necessarily budgeting for a surplus, although we may have requirements as part of our expenditures to make contributions to reserve funds where we know that there's a commitment against those expenses that may not be incurred in the current year, but might be needed in years 2, 3, or 4, so that we're setting the funds aside to enable us to enter into those commitments.
So there is an incentive to be able to generate surplus. Thank you, Steve. And there was a question coming from up there in the gallery. We'll send you the mic in a moment.
Hi, thanks to each of you for the presentations. Steve, you mentioned the 15% cap on the debt servicing amount. Generally, who holds the city's debt?
It's a great question, and I wish Randy in our capital markets was here. So we have, I'm just going to make sure I'm looking so you don't see the side of my head, but we have a debenture committee. So essentially what the city does is we do a lot of work as part of the budget planning and working with our capital markets to identify what our borrowing needs will be. And again, our borrowing needs are restricted to our capital budget. We don't borrow against operating expenses. We don't run a deficit in that place. It's only where we link it to an actual tangible capital asset. We'll work and model what that amount of borrowing we can afford any year to stay within our debt guidelines and ensure fiscal sustainability. Then our capital markets teams are actually, they'll work with financial institutions, and we'll go about actually issuing that debt. One interesting thing that we've been doing over the last few years, and Toronto's actually a leader in this, is green bonds, where we're actually packaging capital investments that help support climate initiatives and ensure that our investors, and often investors that are looking for those types of investments, are taking on our debt to be able to support that work. We've also introduced social bonds. Again, investments that we might be making in affordable housing or other social programs. And again, there's an interest in investors to be able to take that on. In terms of who's actually holding it, unfortunately, I don't have that information off the top of my head, but there is a process where essentially we're working with financial institutions to acquire investors in our debt.
Thank you for the question and the answer, Steve. Just a reminder, if you're joining us from WebEx, you can still submit your questions through the Q&A function. I'm going to scan around the room to see if this question is one coming right there. Go ahead, Fatima.
First of all, good morning, and thank you for taking time from your day today to come to conference. Greatly appreciated. So this is a housing question. I wrote it down because it is quite thick and dense, but I hope you guys have answers. So what initiative is the city implementing to create affordable and quality housing? This question is geared towards subsidizing housing specifically. Recently, during May, a Hyde Park TCH complex experienced a ceiling collapse. This poses a threat to TCHC residents, and this is a recurring theme throughout the GTA. So is TCHC a priority, and what initiatives do you guys have towards this? Thank you.
think I'll jump in. No, and thank you for the question. That's a fantastic question. Housing is an absolute capital priority. When I started in the city, I think the majority of our capital program outside of, being directed to SOGR tended to be directed towards transit, where we had a significant capital need. That has shifted. That's really shifted over the last that has shifted over the last 5-7 years, where there's been considerable investments in housing. And in fact, if you look at our capital program to date, through a combination of direct investments and foregone revenue, and foregone revenue is essentially where we help support affordable housing through waiving of development charges, through waiving of fees, land that is made available. We invest $8 billion over a 10-year period. And that includes, I think it would have been about 3 years ago, where for the first time, we actually fully addressed the capital needs of TCHC, where we added $1.6 billion in investments that also leveraged a co-investment from the federal government to be able to address the steady good repair backlog in our TCHC homes. We've also introduced the Housing Now program, where the city is looking to be able to create 40,000 affordable homes in the city, 20,000 directly from the city contributing both direct investments as well as incentives in the form of foregone revenue and things of that matter, as well as working with the federal and provincial government to try to secure 10,000 or funding towards 10,000 units each from those level of governments. But it's definitely been a key priority. And I think if you look at our capital plan and the amount of our capital plan that is actually now directed to housing, which we're talking about growth and significant growth over the last 5 years, it's definitely a concern and a priority for the city and where we're making a lot of our funds available towards.
I'm wondering if the other speakers like chime in, Karen or Mike?
Thank you, Leslie. And Stephen gave a really good overview of the financial priorities and the fact that housing is right up there in the perhaps I would say the top 3 of our programs and services. And just one quick mention about what the city is doing organizationally to strengthen our stewardship of public housing, affordable housing, and actually increasingly now market housing as well. Organizationally, the programs pertaining to housing is linked between, those are linked between CREATEO, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, and Toronto Seniors Housing Corporation. There's a focus on senior support. There's a focus on community housing improvements and dedicated services to residents, actually resident-focused services. And then there's CREATEO that provides the city strategic advice on how to best manage its assets to make sure that it meets those housing priorities. So increasingly, there's really tight integration at the city to manage those assets and make sure that we optimize housing for residents in need.
Thank you, Steve and Karen. I'm scanning. There's a question right there from the lady in the front. We'll get the mic to you in a moment. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. My question is, let's say an individual with a disability, previously owns a home, but then has a disability and now can't afford the housing out there, but the mortgage is much cheaper where they're at. What happens to the services out there? Because I find that I think it's difficult for them to get those ODSP kind of services to kind of help because they own a home. So I don't know if that question makes sense.
I mean, it's a really valuable question and actual perspective. The provision, can you hear me? Sorry. No, I think it's a very important question. I'm not sure we have the people in the room to give you a fulsome answer on that. But I think increasingly the City of Toronto has to look at, the portability of benefits that would allow for there to be supports outside of affordable and supportive housing that we now provide. And I see that as inevitable that we would start looking at those options. Unfortunately, the people that could give you a really deep answer on that are not available. And perhaps I'm thinking we can take it away and get you a better response.
I have a question submitted online, so I'll get to that because I like to involve the online crowd as well. I'm going to read the question verbatim. It's a question for Steve regarding property tax increases as a source of revenue. So the question goes as follows. As said earlier in the presentation, a 1% increase in residential property tax results in roughly $34 million in revenue. Is this based on a 1% increase on the 0.63% total tax rate? That is to say, an increase of 0.0063%, or based on a flat 1% per property total tax rate increase?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So when we say a 1% tax increase, what we refer to is we'll look at what the average property tax is for a resident in the city of Toronto. And we'll say, what would a 1% increase be to what they're paying today? And that's applied against, depending on the assessed value of the property, it'd be consistent across all, equivalent to 1%. So obviously, if it's a lower valued home, it'd be lower, higher value would be higher. And essentially, that is then applied, and that's what generates the expected 34 million. I think I might have some information here just in terms of what the average value per home is. So our base property taxes today, the average is about $3,300. And then that's when we say 1%, we're talking about a 1% increase against that $3,300 per year.
I'm going to abuse my privilege as a moderator and ask a question of my own. And this is written from a perspective of constraint based on the presentations we've been hearing, how things are predetermined for the city at the provincial and the federal level. Now, Toronto is often spoken of in terms of a global or world city. And the question is, is this a case of the city punching above its weight, considering that there's no independent powers? Would Toronto do better if it had some independent powers of its own? And in the line of your work, what might some of these independent powers look like?
I'll go first. Just to give you what I see would be a good overview response to that, Leslie. That's a great question. It's actually, that question gets to the heart of intergovernmental and international engagement. The assumption going into our engagement is that Toronto is a major order of government in Canada and worldwide. And we see increasingly, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada is doing really well on the world stage in terms of leadership there as well. So is the Premier, and so is the Toronto government. We have contingencies going out to other municipalities across the globe, and we have them coming into the city of Toronto. It is not well known that Toronto has extraordinary powers under the City of Toronto Act. It's not quite a charter city, but the City of Toronto Act 2006 introduced major powers for City of Toronto, including, revenue tools and legislative powers over its many agencies and corporations, and a great deal of autonomy in various areas of governance. And we have taken that and ran with it. And the reality is that Toronto is the major engine, and we take that responsibility seriously. And so we engage at a very senior level, government to government, Toronto government to the feds and the province, and Toronto government providing leadership to the municipalities within Ontario. I don't think it's an overreach. I think that we can optimize more of the powers we actually have in the City of Toronto, 2006. Stephen, can you add some thoughts to that as well?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for highlighting the City of Toronto Act. I think that does give us some powers. I think you asked the question, are we punching above our weight? I don't think we are. I think we are a world-class city. I think we do. And I think we need to take it upon ourselves to be a leader in certain areas. And I think you've seen it, even in the midst of the pandemic. The steps we've taken as part of our vaccination program and our public health measures are definitely world-class. The investments, and I can tell you from our perspective, how we're shaping and shifting our budget process to ensure that we're doing it in an equity responsive fashion, that we're incorporating a climate lens. I think these are all really important. I think these are ways that really ensure that the city is trying to shape, what we need to do and what the city needs to become. And I will also say, as goes Toronto, so does the province and so does the country. And I think it's really important to appreciate that there's shared goals, there's shared objectives. In terms of what we could have is ensuring, we continue to have that collaboration with the feds and province and understand how the city contributes to the success, the economic success of the entire country. And ensuring that we're working together to be able to collectively achieve that and achieve our climate goals, our equity goals, and everything else that we share in common.
Thank you, Karen C. We have time for one last question. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, it's kind of a long, multi-part question, so answer as much of it as you can, and it's for Steve mostly. So if you replaced a surface parking lot or even a multi-story parking garage with dense housing, could you make more money off of property tax than the parking lot makes from parking fees? And as we look for better use of our land, do you think limiting the need for cars and promoting public transit, walking, and riding bikes, especially in the suburbs, could create more revenue in the city? And I'm asking because I'm interested in how safer streets could contribute to saving or making more money for the city, and how having safer streets could encourage outdoor activity, especially in children, to try and help fight the obesity epidemic. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks for the question. So interesting question, especially on the surface parking lots, which is, I think, since I've started in the city, it's something you've actually seen quite a bit. I still remember when I was going to university in Toronto, there were surface parking lots everywhere. And it's hard to even find them today. And I think from the TPA perspective, the Toronto Parking Authority, which is an agency of the city, we've actually leveraged a lot of that land to do exactly what you're saying. In some cases, if it was an area that benefited from commercial use, we may still maintain a parking garage, but be able to leverage the air rights and have a joint venture agreement that return more profit to the city. And really what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years is we're actually using that land for a lot of our affordable housing initiatives. And when I talked about incentives that we're providing for affordable housing, a lot of that is actually the land use. And it's that land that we have available and being able to ensure we are building density in that area and ensuring that there's affordable units. And that's helping contribute to the city's Housing Now objectives. In terms of moving people from cars and onto transit, that's part of our transit expansion goals. That's part of our investments in our core transit infrastructure. Ensuring we have those bus services, we have the subway services. We're looking at efficiencies on line 1 and line 2 to speed the frequency of our transit and reduce those headways and ensure that that is a viable and that's an option that people are willing to take. Obviously, the pandemic has had some challenges as it relates to that, but that has always been a key priority and a reason why we're making those investments in transit expansion and ensuring we have access, not just across the city, but even regionally, to be able to support the movement of people within the city without the reliance on an automobile. And then beyond that, you talked about, we've got a cycling plan. We're trying to make sure we have paths in place. And that's really about livable city. And, I think that's another big part of where we make investments. We want to make sure it's a livable city and we have those opportunities for everyone. But all key priorities and all areas that we're actively trying to pursue, both in our capital investments as well as supporting the operating impacts. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Just time left for me for some closing remarks. I'd just like to thank everyone again for being here in person and online. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming sessions. And the next one will be held on Friday, 7th October and the theme is on building an equitable city. Now, before that, and in the spirit of collaboration, Dr. Sarah Diamond from OCAD University, she's seated right here in the front, she's organizing two cross-institutional walking art tours in downtown Toronto. The first will take place on Monday, 26 September. You're welcome, you and your instructors are welcome to join in, and please meet at the front doors of City Hall at 11 a.m. It will last for an hour and a half. And then the second tour will be scheduled for Thursday, 29 September at 3 p.m. And the meeting point is Butterfly Park at the OCAD University grounds. It will also last for 90 minutes. And the focus of both of these tours is to examine the history and the intent of art installations in the downtown core. So this is all that we have for you today. Thank you to our speakers, Karen, Steve, and Mike online. We hope to see you the next time. Have a good weekend. Thank you.